Hello and welcome back to another Doctor Who Big Finish audio drama review on the Host Productions. In today's review we are going to be continuing to take a look at the 60th anniversary celebrations at Big Finish within the series Once and Future. In today's review, the 5th instalment featuring an episode called The Martian Invasion of Planetoid 50, as written by Jonathan Barnes. This release is of course available to order now on the Big Finish website. The standard edition does of course have a physical CD as well as a digital download and can be purchased as part of a bundle alongside the rest of the releases. Although to note, there is also a collector's edition bundle that could be purchased altogether featuring all of the episodes within this series. It also included exclusive cover artwork as well as inner booklet with exclusive features, extended behind the scenes, and it is of course limited to 3,000 units, although this version of Once and Future has now long sold out. Regardless of which version of Once and Future you decide to get, both of the versions do remain exactly the same, so the story itself does of course contain naturally exactly the same narrative. As always with these reviews, even though Once and Future features some somewhat standalone stories, I still recommend going back to the very beginning and listening to all of the reviews within this series so far in order to get my general opinion of the series as an overall package. The stories do have a plot arc that links all of the episodes together, but the plots themselves are somewhat individual, featuring unique characters, and of course we have the Doctor suffering from his degeneration problem. For new series fans, of course this episode is quite exciting as we have a predominantly new series focused cast for the most part, with of course the 10th Doctor at the helm this time round. So Once and Future continues with the Martian invasion of Planetoid 50 as written by Jonathan Barnes. This story features quite the pairing with Michelle Gomez as Missy alongside David Tennant as the not quite, somewhat is, somewhat isn't, mind going a little bit funny 10th Doctor. The companions of the piece are the Paternoster gang, being made up of Jenny, Vastra and Strax, and I must admit I was less excited about these characters. I listened to a few of their early outings within the Big Finish catalogue within their early box sets, and it quickly became apparent that I was attempting to fill the hole left by Jago and Lightfoot, which did of course have sadly a rather sudden end a number of years ago after the passing of Trevor Baxter, who played Professor George Lightfoot. Even now, I do look back and consider the fact that it is highly likely Jago and Lightfoot would have been a part of Once and Future somehow, and this episode was probably the likely one that they would have featured within. I miss the Infernal Investigators dearly. So I did really try to put that aside for this story, and you know what, it somewhat worked. The way Jonathan Barnes has written these characters rather made me enjoy them. The performances of Dan Starkey, Catherine Stewart and Neve McIntosh are all rather humorous, charming, and definitely match the energy of the story. Jenny is a little bit brainwashed within the earlier scenes within the story, acting as a servant for Missy. Meanwhile, Vastra has been imprisoned. This does rather test their relationship, and I thought it made their connection to one another rather prominent and believable, especially when that is dug into a little bit more within the later half of this story. Strax has quite a number of funny moments, and I personally think quite a lot of the jokes landed well. His hatred for pears once more makes a return, rather hilariously being blamed for the Doctor's degeneration problem, which is certainly one of the personal highlights for me within this episode. Yes, Strax, it is definitely down to pears, that's why this entire series exists. All of the Paternoster trio match the rather absurd themes within this story, the fast-paced energy, but also the energetic nature of the Tennant Doctor. I think that as a Doctor and companion pairing, the team do in fact work very well together, which is interesting given that they've technically never met before. Hannah Genesius should also not be overlooked as Jessamy Moore, a writer from 1898. She is determined to capture the events of the invasion within her own words, and I think her journal provides a rather nice thematic backbone to the overall plot. If anything, she is one of the main anchors to the core theme within this story, being a skewed Doctor Who take on the H.G. Wells classic The War of the Worlds, which funnily enough, in fact Big Finish have also adapted in recent years. The actual concept of this story is crazy, especially when you attach the Planetoid 50 aspects to the plot. Again, this craziness kind of ties in well with Missy's personality. And speaking of Missy, again, she's a character that I'm not too keen on audio, so if anything, I feel like this story really shouldn't be for me. I've mentioned this before, but sadly my love for the stylish charm of the Jacoby Master within the War Master series has escalated my expectations for any Master-specific series that Big Finish produce. What works so well with the War Master series is that each box set has a theme or a direction, it's driving for something and it has a purpose, which I think can somewhat be missing from other Big Finish spin-offs. But within this story, Michelle does continue to offer her own unique take on the Master, or Missy, and I think that she's rather funny, witty, she's got some great dark humour, and regardless of if she's interacting with a friend or foe, she somewhat treats everyone weirdly the same. She's sharp and prickly, and what I rather love is that when she's delivering sinister threats and remarks, she does so with a smile on her face, which makes it again rather funny, but also incredibly sinister. I think that if you are someone who has a preference to the classic versions of the Master or the Jacoby Master, I can completely understand why perhaps Missy does not connect with you too much. I think that I'm in fact in a very similar boat, but I think the way that she's written within this story really does rather work. For some reason, the narrative really clicked with me, I had fun with it, and the plot made for a relatively easy listen, much like the vast majority of this series. It's bold, and I certainly got the impression that Jonathan Barnes had a great understanding of the characters. He also brought something of his own to the table, and managed to tie in some subtle little references to the rest of Doctor Who history, as always, this is an anniversary special, so to speak. And naturally, of course, I am incredibly excited because Stephen Noonan's First Doctor also makes a more present appearance within the opening minutes of this episode, and I really love that. We've seen him hanging around throughout the previous stories with the odd line here and there. This time we have him actually interacting with Jessamy, which is a really lovely way to introduce the story. I really do enjoy Noonan's performance as the First Doctor. He captures that early simplicity and charm of 60s Who absolutely down to a T. For me personally as a listener, he is becoming quite an audio drama comfort blanket. It also provides a lovely stark contrast with the energetic Tennant Doctor. Perhaps this makes the whole theme of this series hit home a little bit deeper than usual, with the whole degeneration problem. And then of course we have Tennant playing a version of the Doctor without the memories of the 10th Doctor, which somewhat jolted me to the viewpoint where it felt like that we were viewing this story for a point in time within the Doctor Who universe which doesn't particularly exist. It's like this episode is almost out of time of the overall canon, which I've just realised I've self-quoted the other David Tennant 10th Doctor series that Big Finish produce. As I have already mentioned within the previous reviews, personally I would have preferred to see more degeneration hopping throughout this series, perhaps one episode containing multiple incarnations, sort of controlling the narrative and doing their own thing. However, within this story we do get a bit closer to that, with of course Stephen Noonan's First Doctor taking up maybe the first 10 minutes or so, which I think if this episode was released a number of years ago, you could have probably critiqued that and said, oh, it's a shame we don't really get much 10th Doctor on Big Finish. So it would have been nice to see him take the helm for the full story instead, but I think certainly given the sheer amount of 10th Doctor content that we've been given for the past few years, this was another release that was indeed recorded within lockdown, and of course especially now considering the fact that since lockdown David Tennant has now been recast as the 14th Doctor, I suppose having another classic incarnation within this story is a nice little touch. It adds something to this story which I think other episodes lack. I've mentioned within my previous reviews my critiques of the overall series format. The stories are a little bit too isolated for my liking. I think it should rely a little bit more heavily on the plot arc, and I want more focus on the degeneration concept. This episode starts to stray a little bit more to that reality. As I've mentioned before, it's treading on that fine balance between celebrating the 60th, being accessible to less experienced Big Finish audiences, whilst also marketing Big Finish and what they can offer overall, providing insight to the many corners of the catalogue where possible. Ultimately, this series is a big advertisement for Big Finish, there is no denying that, which I think a more integrated plot arc would probably daunt less experienced listeners. It would also feature a less varied cast, and become far less accessible from a standalone story point of view. One of the big things that makes this story rather enjoyable is Tennant and Gomez. I think that their warmth within the story and the way that they bounce off each other can be quite overwhelming at times, and that may at first sound like a critique, but I think that the way that they bounce off each other, it really does intrigue me, and I think that it draws me into the story. It makes me feel more immersed, but at the same time it is very over the top. If anything, it's a very over the top energetic Doctor meets a very over-the-top energetic Master, and if you're someone who doesn't like Missy's personality, the way that she utilises impression and accents and has these sudden bursts of rants and energy and quirks and jokes, then this episode probably will not be for you, because it contains quite a lot of that. But I think that it works within this story because the surrounding cast equally match that energy, and the overall plot is so Missy orientated. The whole reason why this story has came about is so brilliantly Missy. It all somewhat works as an overall package, especially when you tie in the H.G. Wells elements of the narrative too. And again, it just makes the episode feel like a lot of fun. And in particular, there's a moment within the story where Missy in fact reflects on her previous incarnations, as I was joking about a little bit, saying she's no longer them anymore. And she also mentions how her attention span within this incarnation is incredibly lacking and kind of hops between different things, which I like that. And I think that those little things that we perhaps don't really see within the Doctor as much, or at least maybe within Missy or the various incarnations of the Master, it's a bit more exaggerated. But I think that it actually makes Missy somewhat a bit more relatable, and how different people that we know have different attention spans and think about things differently. Everyone has a different approach to doing things, and I like the way this story somewhat subtly references that. By having standalone stories, I think perhaps it does reduce the overall stakes of the plot arc, although I think Barnes's writing paired with Gomez and Tennant's performance does up those stakes a little bit more drastically compared to the previous releases, which is definitely needed at this point within this series. I definitely got on board with the plot within this story a lot more than I thought I would, especially given that I wasn't particularly too taken by the Paternoster gang or Missy, but to be honest, I came out of the other side having rather enjoyed it. It's fun, bizarre, and plays to the characters' strengths, which I think is what makes this story work as much as it does. It led to me enjoying it, but it appears that the vast majority of Once and Future's narrative will probably be delivered in that final instalment after the accumulation of the small clues that have been set in place throughout this series so far. So if you've not listened to Once and Future, the one way that I can explain it in its simplest form is basically a treasure hunt, and that final bit of treasure at the end is the actual Once and Future narrative, the core heart of this series. So thank you very much for watching this review. I really hope you have enjoyed it. Do of course stay tuned on The Host Productions for regular audio drama content, of course reactions to the latest Big Finish releases, and of course the continuation of this series of reviews. We've got some very exciting audio dramas coming up, including David Warner making his final appearance as the Unbound Doctor alongside Christopher Eccleston's Ninth Doctor, which is very exciting indeed. So thanks for watching, have a nice day, I shall see you all next time.